kind of briefly introduce, myself and kind of the purpose of the series. But to, kick us off, we have a lot of great questions we're going to cover with our amazing panelists, but this is kind of our how we're going to spend our time today. So I'll briefly go over what the purpose of the series is. And we also have pre and post tests embedded into our time, just so we can get a measure of knowledge prior to the panel and then knowledge following the panel. And then we're going to move into our panelist introductions and then have questions. We already have kind of determined questions for them that they're going to answer. And then at the end, we're going to have a little Q&A. So if anyone from the audience wants to ask a question, that will be the time for the panelists to answer. And feel free to type your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and trying to keep tabs of what comes through the chat. And then afterwards, there's a QR code for if there are students here who are interested in applying to graduate programs in behavior analysis. We have a raffle to cover one graduate application fee. Okay, so really the purpose of our ABA Beyond ASD series is to expose students at the undergraduate and graduate levels to the different applications of behavior analysis beyond autism spectrum disorder and related developmental disabilities, because our science can do so many things, and a lot of us work in different areas. And so with this series, we hope to introduce students to different leaders in our field in different subspecialties. And like I mentioned before, I'm Natalia Baires. Then I also have my colleagues here, Dr. Natalie Williams Awodeha and then Dr. Lesley Shawler, and us kind of as a group put together the series. And we were fortunate enough to receive funding from SEAB, or the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, through their educational grants for us to put on these different panels for you all. And I think I forgot to mention that we are recording this, and it will be available. We have a YouTube page. We'll post it on our YouTube page. And after the panel, if you registered, you'll get a link to the recording, as well as a resources page related to our topic today, which is sustainability and climate change. So here we have two different, I guess, surveys. If you would all be so kind as to fill out the survey. So we're collecting demographic information. So we're interested in knowing, backgrounds of who's attending our panels, who we're able to reach. So that's the QR code on the left. So you can use your phone, turn on the camera, and you can scan the code to access that. And then, and I think we'll also put the link in the chat if that's easier for people. And we also have on the right-hand side, a link to our pre-test. And so these are questions just to assess knowledge right prior to the panel related to our topic today. So I think those links are already in the chat. Thank you, Dr. Williams Awodeha. Okay, so I'll move on in the interest of time. And again, if you are a student who's interested in applying to graduate school in behavior analysis, we have a raffle for you to enter. So feel free to scan the QR code, and the link will be put in the chat as well. And I believe at the end of our the hour today, I think we'll pick someone to see who won the raffle. All right, so now that we got all that kind of housekeeping things out of the way, we'll move on to the fun part. So we have two amazing panelists today, Dr. Andrew Bonner and Dr. Julia Fiebig, who are joining us today. And so I'll kind of transition into our first question, which is to have both panelists share a little bit about themselves, and we can kind of alternate the order. So Dr. Fiebig, if you want to, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Fiebig, and I have been a behavior analyst for, I think, 20 some years or so. And my initial interest was, in fact, in sustainability. But at the time, I was at the University of Florida and really dove deep into learning about and then practicing with individuals with autism and developmental disabilities, and then later moved a little bit more into working with staff and organizations in that context. And I'm currently a professor in Ball State's master's program, and I also spend a good bit of time consulting with organizations who are interested in sustainability from a number of different dimensions. Part of my background also is that I teach people and work with groups who are not getting along very well or who are not very effective in how they're working together. And my training there is in systems of consensus-based decision making and kind of planting more pro-social seeds, which is very much a part of what we need when we're talking about sustainability in context of climate change or sustainability in context of many different systems. And I live in Northern California. And I think I'll leave it there. I think that's enough about me, Andrew.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, so like so many behavior analysts, I kind of got my start working with individuals with developmental disabilities, specifically in the area of assessment of treatment of severe problem behavior. And I had been doing behavior analysis for a few years without really understanding like the conceptual underpinnings of our science or understanding the reasons why behavior analysts do the things they do. So I pursued graduate training in behavior analysis so that I could become a board certified behavior analyst. And found myself at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, doing a master's degree. And while I was there, I was working full-time at the Kennedy Krieger Institute on the neurobehavioral unit. And, you know, during the 2 years when I was doing my master's degree, like, really started to look at the world a lot differently as a function of my experience in my graduate program and the work that I was doing. And I remember like pretty vividly at the end of the graduate program, like I didn't really feel like I had a chance to look up and take a breath while I was studying. It's just the UMBC program is just sort of transformative in a lot of different ways. But when I remember standing outside of the Kennedy Krieger Institute after work one day and kind of finally looked up from my notes that I was studying for and looked around and just saw a large range of different behavior problems, from substance abuse and homelessness, and there was pollution everywhere, and there was just a number of issues. And I kind of thought to myself, like, hey, like our science can help understand these behavior problems and even influence or ameliorate those issues. And so I wasn't quite ready to sort of begin working in those spaces, but I remember very vividly sort of becoming thirsty for broader applications of behavior analysis at that time. And I pursued doctoral training in behavior analysis. I found myself at the University of Florida and was really fortunate in some ways. I was still doing assessment and treatment of severe problem behavior, but it sort of had these interests lingering, and sort of was talking to my advisor at the University of Florida, Willie DeLeon, who really, you know, is an expert in the area of assessment and treatment of severe problem behavior, among other things, for individuals with developmental disability, but still interested in these things. And so he and I sort of got to talking about some different ways we could approach these issues, kind of as like a, I don't know, as like a fun sort of, you know, offshoot of some of the other projects we were working on. And then the pandemic hit. I was in the middle of my doctoral program when the pandemic hit. And so we needed to stop conducting in-person research at that time. And so I was pretty fortunate that I had developed some research protocols around measuring and influencing people's carbon footprints relevant to their transportation, so gasoline consumption. And it kind of worked out that I was able to collect a lot of data without any in-person contact. And that kind of turned into my dissertation at the University of Florida. And so that was kind of my first step into working into the sort of sustainability space was my dissertation. We conducted several different studies in that area. And around the same time, ABAI had launched this coalition of behavior science organizations climate change task force, which Dr. Fiebig also served on. And so we were sort of thinking about like large scale implementations of behavioral interventions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the projects that that task force completed was sort of a comprehensive search of the literature for large-scale interventions that we could replicate or we recommend as possible solutions to this issue. And then as a function of my experience on that task force, I kind of started working a little bit more closely with Tony Biglin and his nonprofit called Values to Action. And in that context, we started bringing folks together to work on different climate issues. And so we had a few different action circles, we call them, where we get passionate people together to make a difference in certain areas. And so we conducted an assessment of the federal funding portfolio for behavioral interventions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We published a conceptual piece on how behavior analytic community might be able to make a difference on large scales, although if I can provide some commentary on my own writing, I wish I could rewrite that paper because I think I would do it a little differently now, or I would write it a little differently now, but I'm digressing a little bit there. And so I've been sort of working in the climate change space on and off for the last several years, working on various projects. I've got a few protocols sort of cooking up right now, one of which is aimed at influencing the consumption of plant-rich foods by labeling restaurant menus according to each menu item's carbon footprint. And so we're sort of working that protocol right now a little bit. And then one of the projects that's on the horizon at Values to Action is developing strategies for measuring the carbon footprint of communities as a first step towards influencing the emissions of those communities. And so we've been sort of working in different project areas for the last few years in the sustainability, climate change space. After I graduated, I took a position at Northeastern University as a clinical professor, and I'm transitioning now from that position to a new position at Florida State University. And so that's primarily where I'm taking my sort of behavior analytic teaching skills is to Florida State University, where I'll be a teaching faculty as of the fall semester that's upcoming right now. So I guess fall 2023. And yeah, I guess that kind of brings you up to speed on who I am and where I've been and where I'm going.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. It's always, I think, like you said, Dr. Bonner, like a lot of us start working with individuals with developmental disabilities or ASD, and then it's always interesting to see how we all branch out. So thank you both for sharing a bit about yourself. All right, so our next question, and we can start with you, Dr. Bonner, if that's all right. How would you define sustainability, or how would you define or explain climate change, maybe from a behavior analytic perspective?
Yeah, sure. So I think in some ways it's easier to start maybe with climate change. Like when I think of climate change, what I'm thinking of are significant changes in average or prototypical conditions relevant to temperature, rainfall, wind patterns, other weather events. And those changes occur over fairly large time spans. So if you were to look at like a continuous record of the natural variability of Earth's climate over like millions of years, what you would see is some natural variation and fluctuation in some of those patterns based on like where the Earth is in orbit around the sun, et cetera. But what is being projected now are deviations that are more pronounced and more marked than anything we've seen over the last several million years. And those deviations, that's climate change. If you were to sort of line it all up on a graphic depiction, if you will, looking at sort of like the natural variations of our climate over long periods of time. And so for me, that's kind of climate change, those marked deviations. And I think the nicest definition, the most succinct definition, comes from a behavior analytic article published in the Behavior Analyst back in 2010, that defined climate change as a finite capacity of the Earth's atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gas emissions while still maintaining historical temperature ranges. And so we're getting to this point where our atmosphere can no longer absorb greenhouse gas emissions and maintain those natural sort of historic fluctuations or variations in our climate, leading to these pronounced changes or deviations that are predicted to come in the future that are very different than anything we've seen over the last, like long periods of time. And so for me, that's what climate change is, that finite capacity of our atmosphere to absorb the greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting and continue to maintain those historical temperature ranges.
Right, thank you, Dr. Fiebig.
Sure. So I think for me, climate change is an outcome of a collection of many, many, many behaviors and systemic issues. And so for me, the most interesting question, I think, is not what is sustainability, but what does it mean to sustain? What does it mean to sustain at the level of self, at the level of local community, larger community, and then really looking at our global systems. And what I mean with global systems is, if you're familiar with Skinner's Science and Human Behavior, where he talks about the 5 areas of kind of control, I guess: education, mental health, the government, law enforcement, and so on. And there are a number of others. I think we published, I and 2 colleagues published a textbook / hopefully a book written in a more friendly way on relational frame theory, and kind of how the way in which we engage and use language, it influences us at all of those systems, and how we can influence. And so when thinking about what is sustainability and what does it mean to sustain, I think my biggest take-home point is, yes, we should connect it to climate change and to that outcome of really the Earth being out of balance. We, at the moment, have used 1.8 Earths in terms of the resources the Earth has to offer. But what we really need to look at is really a more circular way of looking at our resources. So something called regenerative systems or circular economies, if you're familiar with those terms, and looking more carefully at not just reduction of resources, but how we are using them differently. And so I guess to summarize that, I would think about sustainability in terms of keeping resources and use of those resources in balance. And that is not just our fossil fuel resources, our water, but also looking at inequities in our communities, and who is able to use what resources, who has access to what, who does not, and so on.
Yeah, Dr. Fiebig, I really like the way you phrased that. Like, to me, sustainability is always just about balance between sort of like a finite amount of resources, equity, giving folks what they need right now to thrive, our economy, because everything is built around this growth economy. And so there's an argument to be made that like you can't actually have growth and development and sustainability, because growth requires increasing the amount of resources going into the system in order to produce profit. But that's a different.
Not necessarily, but I think that's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I know there's a conversation there to be had. That could be a panel in itself, right? But for me, when I think about sustainability too, I'm always thinking about like future generations having what they need to thrive, and doing what we can do right now to not only continue to thrive ourselves, but to ensure that future generations have what they need as well. And that for me is that balance, in order to strike that balance so that future generations can thrive.
Yeah, and I would add that that current populations have a more equitable distribution of who is accessing and who is bearing the burden.
I have so many follow-up questions, but that I'm not gonna even try because I know we have other questions, but thank you both for sharing your thoughts on these two terms. All right. I guess if you want to start, Dr. Fiebig, with this question.
Sure.
Within this your line of work, what populations do you typically work with, or what settings do you typically work in?
Yeah, a whole bunch, and I'll just give you kind of a bit of an example because I think it might illustrate how wide-reaching these issues are and that it's not straightforward. So I mentioned earlier that I do a good bit of consultation and with different organizations, and the starting point there has always been, or usually been, something about discord within an administrative group or a leadership group or culture issues. And so I think when we're talking about subspecialty in terms of sustainability, it's really, really important to understand that having a good grasp on systems work and behavioral systems analysis and organizational behavior management is really critical, I think, to doing work in this space. The work I've done has ranged from one of the things that came out of the task force that Andrew mentioned, because a few of us gave workshops at different conferences, non-behavior analytic conferences, which I think is also a very important dimension of like putting yourself in other spaces. But we conducted a couple workshops where I was able to contact people who work for the United Nations Global Climate Fund, and that resulted in about a year and a half of follow-up consultation with them, which really boiled down to identifying that their application system for how they were making decisions about who received what funds for the projects that were being done had no accountability built into them, right? So applicants didn't have to identify how they were going to behaviorally measure the outcomes that they were hoping for. And so it was a whole lot of money wasted. Other things that I've been able to contact is working with a really small company that built portable machines that basically took biomass and created electricity out of them. And I did very little with that piece of it, but their leadership team was in complete discord because they had received a very large grant over a couple years into the future and realized that if they could not get in agreement about what their values were as a leadership team and what their outcomes were going to be based on those values, that opportunity would be squandered. Other work that I do is, and this is something I'm very, very passionate about, has very much to do with helping behavior analysts who are early career, mid-career, making inroads into other areas. For me, that has felt like a very long road. For the past 12 years, I would say. It included going back to graduate school for sustainability, and realizing that would put me in contact and give me a more specific expertise. And so I also spend a lot of time supporting and helping run some of our special interest groups in the ABAI community. So Behavior Analysts for Sustainable Societies, I helped start that SIG, I think 12, 13 years ago. And then I also collaborate with the Sustainability Working Group. That's a collaboration with the Behaviors for Social Responsibility, SIG. I would encourage you to look into both of those. BAS has monthly community meetings, which anybody is welcome to join, and that's a wonderful resource sharing opportunity, and we kind of hold each other accountable for the things we're going to do every month. Those are some examples. And then I've also, I really pay attention to doing what I can locally with particular organizations that are meaningful to me.
Thank you, Dr. Bonner.
Yeah, so this is such like a, climate change is such a pervasive, complex issue. And when you break it down, it's an outcome of all of our consumptive patterns, our behaviors in some way. And so everybody has a role to play in this effort as we approach this sort of net zero where our species is not emitting any more than we can consume or something like that. And so the populations that experts in this area could be working with are vast. Any segment of society is essentially sort of on the table for sustainability-based or climate-based initiatives. And so, for folks who are trying to get into this subspecialty, just know that you can literally pick any sector of society you'd like, anyone that maybe you have close contact with or that a lot about for one reason or another, and there's work to be done in that sector. And so I think that, with respect to sort of what populations we typically work with or what settings, there really is the sky is the limit in terms of the things that you could do if you wanted to work in this space. I found myself as a graduate student, I mentioned my dissertation was with other graduate students or other university students measuring and influencing their carbon footprint relevant to transportation. So kind of small scale work with individuals. And now I'm starting to develop some protocols around group level behavior, such as sort of measuring, like I mentioned, the percent or portion of sales of really sort of carbon heavy dishes off of menus, right? Measuring the aggregate product of a whole bunch of different people's behaviors. And then, what we're working towards at Values to Action with some of our action circles are measuring and influencing entire communities by mobilizing individual sectors within those communities. And so, I think that we're just trying to sort of grab onto various strands of the problem that we think we can be effective or we think that will pay dividends downstream. And so it kind of ranges from individual level, small scale studies, working into larger groups. And then in a perfect world down the road, we would love to be working in entire communities, with contracted by those communities to measure the carbon footprint of that community, however big or small it may be, and then mobilizing various sectors within that community to champion climate initiatives that might pay dividends or move the needle with respect to that community's carbon footprint. But then the other part of it, and this is Dr. Fiebig alluded to this, is getting more people involved in this work, creating inroads for folks who are passionate about these issues. We know that behavior analysts are passionate about a lot of other issues apart from enriching the lives of people with developmental disabilities, but trying to connect those folks with resources and opportunities that will permit them to refine those skill sets so that they feel comfortable working in those spaces. If it's one thing that we all learn in graduate school, it's stay in your lane, practice in your scope of competence. And so while people really want to work in various sectors or various, pursuits, we don't always feel comfortable doing so because we haven't been formally trained, or we don't have supervision, or we don't have the relevant experience, et cetera. And so part of what we're trying to do is give people opportunities to get those relevant skills, to acquire some training or some supervision in these areas so they feel comfortable working in those spaces. And so that's kind of the other segment of it. It's not working necessarily only with people or groups or communities and their carbon footprints, but creating spaces and opportunities for more people to get into this line of work so that we can essentially build like a cadre of behavior analysts who are really pushing in various directions in adding something to the initiatives that are already taking place. And that's where I think behavior analysts can really help, is just contribute to the work that's already being done in various organizations and various communities around the world.
Great, thank you. I'll start off with you.
Sorry, I was muted. May I add a quick comment before we? I think something Dr. Bonner said is a really important take-home point about this. This is an everybody, everywhere, everything kind of a problem and opportunity. And I wanted to reference back because it seems like a good part of this audience is in graduate school or thinking about graduate school. And my dissertation was very challenging to implement, and I also had to rework, but I wanted to look at and ended up looking at what kind of messaging leaders were putting out there in companies that were around changing behavior in the interest of combating climate change. And that came because at the time there was this emergence of the Global Sustainability Officer in many, many organizations. And there's so much money wasted in those behavior change campaigns at like really high levels. And so I was very interested in what are the things that people value that make those uniform messages fall flat or resonate with different people. And I bring this up because I think as you are thinking about how do I do work in this area, how do I find an inroad, I think there's a great importance to expanding the number of behavior analysts working in these spaces, but I think it is also important, personally, I think it is important to sometimes put aside the hanging on to I am a behavior analyst when you are moving through those spaces. If you are looking for jobs or consultation opportunities or training opportunities, I think you have to put that aside. It's going to be called something different, and you have to listen differently and be flexible about, how are you going to, in the moment, do a bit of functional analysis on what's operating for the person across from you or the organization that maybe you want an internship with or a job with, or are pitching a consulting plan to. Okay, I thought that was in context and I didn't want to forget to say it.
Thank you. So I am looking at the time, and I think we have about maybe 10-15 minutes before we maybe move to Q&A. So I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 more questions left. So I guess maybe for the next couple of questions, maybe a couple of minutes each. And I know I hate to
we should talk less, basically.
Yeah. Not my forte, as you can tell, right?
So Dr. Bonner, what training or preparation do you think is needed to work in this subspecialty?
Yeah, well, for me, there's like kind of 2 leading edges of this. There's sort of formal training, and then there's continuing education. And so from the formal training perspective, I really think that ABAI's cultural behavior science core sequence has got to be the future training programs to get folks thinking about cultural systems analysis. There's required experiential learning, applying cultural analysis at multi-level of organized complexity. And so I really think that that is a phenomenal opportunity for existing graduate programs to add something to their curriculum to enhance what we're doing here. There's only 2 of those approved course sequences in the United States, University of Nevada, Reno, and University of North Texas. I really think we need to push more to get more of those course sequences up and running. And then in the area of continuing education, I want to put a plug in for behavioral development solutions. For those of you who don't know, Behavioral Development Solutions runs a BCBA exam preparation, program, and they've established a Center for Behavior and Climate where they've got a programmatic series of continuing education for BCBAs around climate change and the behavioral orientation of climate change. And it's really stellar. I really think that folks, if you haven't already checked that out, go over to that website and check out those CEs for BCBAs. They're really top notch. And I really think those two avenues combined would really sort of like push this field forward in terms of formal training through this cultural behavioral science course sequence and through continuing education. And I really like that the behavioral development solutions, that's programmatic. It's a series of continuing educations that equips learners with a range of ideas, understand concepts and principles they'll need to work in that space. So those 2 areas, I think, for me are really important.
I think beyond a solid foundation in behavior analysis, I think it depends on what you have access to. I mean, that's always the question. And so I know I found myself in a position, I had finished my master's degree at Florida State University, which was in the early 2000s, a very versatile program. It was not focused on any particular specialty. And then I went to conferences that had to do with sustainability, and there are a wealth of webinars, of reading books, so all of those things are very helpful. I found myself at a point where I needed and wanted more than that, because I wanted to be in contact with other people who are focused on studying and doing research and practicing in sustainability spaces. And so I had access to going back and doing a graduate certificate that was a multidisciplinary graduate certificate in sustainability, and it put me in contact with other people who had their masters or PhDs in different areas and had similar aims. And that for me made a really, really big difference in the last couple of years in terms of getting in contact with others where that work felt more accessible to me. It is not realistic, I think, if you're wanting to go to grad school right now, or if you're in grad school, to just switch programs if you don't have access to what Andrew alluded to, the CBS track that UNR and UNT have established. But what you can do, and what I did when I was getting my PhD, I went to other departments and took electives that supported my dissertation. And I also made sure that my dissertation was representative of the work that I wanted to do later. I wanted to do work that impacted climate change, that looked at the analysis of language, and that looked at organizational systems. And so I advocated to be able to take those courses, which was extra work for me, but it was well worth it.
Great, thank you. I think maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'll move to do either of you, either of you aware of any mentorship or supervised field work or employment opportunities to work in this area?
Yeah, so there's a conference called the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference. It alternates between Sacramento and DC every October and November. And if you're a student, you have an opportunity to apply to attend, have the fees covered, the registration covered for that conference. And they have companies and government agencies from all over the world attend and present, and they put out a list of contact information for those people. They regularly send out emails about internship opportunities. So that is one source that I would highly, highly recommend. If you can't go to the conference, they have an online version. They record talks that you can purchase later. Or if you don't go at all, just get on their email list. That's one tip.
Thank you. Dr. Bonner, do you have any?
Yeah. I think that there's maybe one, I hope I'm wrong about this. And if I am wrong, someone please correct me. But like, I think there's maybe one behavior analytic lab in the country where the majority of the students are all working on climate change issues. And that's Beth Mesh's lab at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. Beth and I have worked on various projects together. I saw her at ABI a few months ago, and she was telling me about all the great work that her students are doing in her lab. And I just don't come across very many labs in behavior analysis that are primarily working on this issue of climate change. But if you are looking for graduate training in behavior analysis with a focus on climate change, check out Beth Mesh's lab at the Chicago School for Professional Psychology. And then I know that I'm plugging the Behavior Development Solutions Center for Behavior and Climate again, but I know they have a number of different internships or interns listed on the center's website. And so there are probably some opportunities for experience there as well.
Thank you.
I guess I would encourage you to think about what you're interested in. So for example, if you're interested in water conservation, look around in the community you're in, or perhaps where you aim to move after graduate school, and look at what organizations there are. And I have had a lot of success just cold turkey writing emails and saying, I'm interested in this, and see what happens. You have to put yourself out there and kind of feel really uncomfortable in the process, but.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I guess I should also plug Values to Action as a social justice oriented nonprofit for folks who are interested in working on climate change issues. We have a number of opportunities to get people involved. Those aren't paid opportunities. It's not formal field work, but it's a chance to work with other folks who are working in the same space, passionate about the same issues as you, working on various issues related to climate change. So valuestooaction.org. I'll put that in the chat too.
Thank you. I guess that's a nice segue to our last question. To our panelists, what advice do you have for students who want to pursue a career in this subspecialty?
Dr. Fiebig?
Yeah. Figure out a good self-care plan, because it's hard. And if you're already on this webinar or listening in later, you're clearly interested, and I'm sure that you have days that feel really depressing. I mean, I know I feel really small sometimes in terms of, is anything I'm going to do even going to have an impact? And so I would say, figure out how you're going to take breaks from it and not be overwhelmed. And the second thing is find community. Find other people who are interested, and not just other behavior analysts. It can be really powerful to step beyond those boundaries.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is seek out folks who are working in the space that you want to work in, it's so rare that if you sent an impassioned email to someone who was working in your space suggesting you wanted to get involved, that they would be like, no, 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 please go away. You know, they are gonna nurture that passion. It's just the nature of the people that work in our field and the nature of the problems that we're working on. If you're passionate about these issues and want to work on them, it doesn't take much to pick the interest of someone who's already working in those spaces. And so, you know, seek out some folks who are already in those spaces, whether that's by attending webinars like this and coming in contact with people who are in these spaces, or reading published articles and then contacting the authors of those articles, or, you know, just through your local network, you know, folks who are working in these spaces, and just put yourself out there. I think that is sort of the essence of what Dr. Fiebig is saying, is don't be afraid to put yourself out there. It will be a little uncomfortable at first. It was for myself when I started working in this space. I'm sure it was for Dr. Fiebig, as she already suggested, when she was trying to build this dissertation around the work she wanted to do. But I think that it's worth it. You will find yourself in a position down the line, and you'll look back and say, I'm glad I took that step, even though it was a little uncomfortable. So seek out people who are in those spaces and start working with them. You know?
Yeah, and come to our community meetings. If you go to Behavior Analysis for Sustainable Societies, that's the SIG. Beth Meshis is actually a board member along with me, and Jessica Guy, and we meet monthly, and there's loads of people who like kind of come at different intervals who are doing really interesting things. Most are behavior analysts, some are not.
Great, thank you. All right, so now we'll move on to audience question and answer. So if anyone has any questions they would like to ask our panelists, feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself, whatever you're comfortable with. So I'll kind of stop talking for a little bit and maybe give people a chance if they want to type something or unmute. You're welcome to do so. All right, so of course, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. But in the meantime, there is a resources page for you all to access. I think it's going to have different just resources of books, you know, all the resources that our panelists mentioned today will be accessible on this document. So it'll be in the chat as well for people if they want to access it.
I will also add some things to that. This weekend I had sick babies the last 2 days, so it deterred my plans. I also, Dr. Baires, I feel like those quiz questions we needed to send, I'm noticing that I only mentioned half of one of those, so I feel like that could be important.
Okay, do we want to, we do have time. If there aren't any questions, we, you know, could use the time to address, you know, some of the things with the post-test. Was
There is one question in the chat or in the Q&A.
okay.
You see it?
Yes.
Yeah. I think what Dr. Eversole has just mentioned in the chat is really important.
Yeah, so it says, perhaps one strategy for determining where BCBAs belong in the sustainability space is to look at the case studies of sustainability professionals and determine what competencies a BCBA might add. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that really strikes to the heart of it. Like, the behavior analytic community is not going to solve this problem for everybody else. We have some skills that we can complement the work that's already been, that's going on, I think. But, you know, that's where I think we need to do sort of a self-study and figure out, well, what kind of things are we good at and where might we be able to contribute, you know? Dr. Fiebig?
Yeah, and I think that's actually a perfect add-on and segue also. I think there's a tendency, if you spend a little time looking at what behavior analytic peer-reviewed literature has been generated around climate change and sustainability topics. It's often conceptual, and when it's not, it's low-hanging fruit, right? So it might be a nice little study on recycling, but you know, not to be Debbie Downer, but recycling is, most of the things we recycle, 90% in fact, end up in landfill anyway. And so if replicating something like that, or putting in place a recycling or composting program in your workplace allows you to practice, I think that's really, really important. And in addition to that, I think we need to expand how we are looking at what are the greatest behaviors of impact. And so take note for your post-test. When we're looking at what, if we globally changed our practices in a couple different areas, the things that would most impact reduction in carbon dioxide are plant-rich diets, are reducing food waste, and education of girls and women. And I think what Stephen has alluded to in terms of looking at case studies of sustainability professionals and competencies a BCBA might add, I suspect that we would find that we have some really big gaps in those of us interested in this area as behavior analysts in really understanding the issues, like really deeply understanding the issues. And if you look at the body of work that has been generated in our field around this topic, it's small change. I don't mean to be negative. We have to have a starting point, but we have to expand beyond that if we're going to be taken seriously as having a seat at the table, and we should have a seat at the table. And I think an analysis of what are the competencies that we could add to our professional repertoires could be telling and really valuable.
Dr. Bonner, anything to add there? Or
Yeah, no, I don't think there's anything else that needs to be said there. Thanks, Julia.
Dr. Fiebig, was there anything else you wanted to add in relation to the post-test questions, or Dr. Bonner?
I mentioned regenerative systems in the beginning and circular economies, and it's not such an unfamiliar term anymore, but I think the point I was trying to make with that is that that kind of systems thinking also gets us away from things like, let's look at recycling, which is a linear process, right? When you recycle things, there are some efforts to bring those materials back into a circular system where we're eliminating waste, not because we're necessarily using less, but because we are transforming that waste into something else. And that's important, kind of that transformation, and that also touches on the idea of regenerating nature. So we have finite resources, and we do have to reduce what we're using, but we also face the reality that we have a large and growing population, and habit change is really hard, especially at a global level. And I know I'm very particular about my recycling and my composting. And when I lived in an apartment complex, for 10 years, it would drive me absolutely crazy to see that both of my neighbors kind of ruined all of my efforts. And so we need better systems that really look at regeneration and circular systems of intervention, I guess, in terms of linear.
So we do have a few more minutes left. Any final kind of things either of our panelists want to share before we close things out? Okay. So I believe, I think Dr. Shawler, the link is to edit the post test. I think that's where it's leading to, but the post test will be linked in the chat. It's also available here as a QR code. So if you filled out the pretest, please be sure to fill out the post test as well. And we only have 2 other topics left in our series. So next month we'll focus on public safety, and then our final panel will focus on crime, delinquency, and forensics. And you can follow us on social media to get more information about who the panelists will be, how to register, you know, all that information. And so a big thank you to our panelists today. I learned a lot. I feel like I have a lot more to learn. I appreciate your willingness to you know, to be here today, to make time for us today, and to share all of your knowledge. And here's I guess I should have asked if this was okay, but having email addresses for our panelists if people would like to reach out.
Yeah, I'm always happy to get emails. Sometimes my response time can be a little long, and I'm never offended if I get a prompt. So feel free to reach out.
Please do. Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I thank you all for, you know, those of you who attended today. Thank you all for joining us. And we will send, like I mentioned before, the link to the recording as well as the resources page. So I hope you all have a great Friday. Have a nice weekend and take care.
Sorry,
Thank you.
you're having trouble with the post test link. If you guys, I think Dr. Williams just reposted it. So if you didn't do it, we would appreciate if you could do it.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.